Hi, welcome to special edition of Education Matters, how New Jersey schools are run, school governance primer. In this episode, we'll be talking about the board meeting and how it works. I think a lot of public members do not have a good understanding of the board meeting, and sometimes that's their first encounter with the school board. So with me, once again, is Kerri Wright, School Board Member of the Year, a board member in Chester and Morris County, and also a school board attorney. And Peter Hughes. Peter is a superintendent in Bergen County, and Peter was also a board member in Morris County, and so both of them go to board meetings from different perspectives, and so it's a good mix, I think. So, Kerri, I'll go to you first on this one. Many public come to the board meeting. Usually, if you have a large crowd, it's usually not positive. It's usually to have maybe a gripe or something that don't understand a decision. And most members come in and they want to have a long dialogue and a conversation with the board. And really, the board meetings are not set up that way.
No, they're not. So the legislature requires through what's called the Open Public Meetings Act, has required that at every session of a public entity, so that's municipalities, boards of ed, state agencies, all of them, there must be an opportunity for the public to comment on matters that are coming before that particular public entity. The legislature did not set it up, though, for it to be a Q&A or a gotcha session, a public discussion. Instead, it is public comment. So I like to describe it for folks as it is a meeting that the public entity, in this case, a Board of Education, is having in public, not a meeting with the public. It's not a discussion. It's not an open public forum. It's an opportunity for members of the public to come and provide their comment on whatever item of concern they may have. A lot of times it is negative, but there are oftentimes folks that want to come to meetings and either provide information or praise a particular program or staff member or initiative. So there's oftentimes some good things too. But yeah, it's meant to be a comment, not a Q&A.
And Peter, how when people come to your board meetings in both venues, you don't personally engage in lengthy conversation, but can you do any follow-up to questions that might arise?
Great question, Ray. Actually, we typically will do a follow-up if it's a short question that somebody asks. As a superintendent, it's my board's meeting. So that's something that's important to remember. The board president is in charge of the meeting. He will direct me to answer any questions that he wants me to answer, or he'll answer them himself, or he will say, thank you for the comment, and we'll look into it and get back to you. That's often how we handle our questions, one of those three ways, or comments. And I will often follow up with someone the day after a board meeting just to have that dialogue, because that dialogue is missing in a board meeting. It's not intended to be a meeting of the board with the public engagement. It's intended to be the board's meeting. To Kerri's point, it's a meeting of the board in public. However, it's also an opportunity for the board to hear from the public, and they are the representatives of the public and the parent community and the students. So it's important that they're informed, and it's an opportunity for people in the public to feel involved and to be heard.
Kerri, you talked about the law on that. What is the Open Public Meetings Act or the Sunshine Law? That's the governing law.
So that is a law passed by the legislature. I don't remember when, but a long time ago. The reason why it's euphemistically described as the Sunshine Law is because it's really meant to bring in the light into public entities. And prior to that, decisions were made without the public really having an opportunity to understand why, to hear their publicly elected officials discuss what's going on. So the Open Public Meetings Act requires that when there is a quorum of board members, they have to give the public appropriate notice They have to give the public advance notice of what they might be reasonably discussing or acting upon, so that if I'm a member of my community and I have an interest in a particular topic, I can look at the agenda, I can know that there's a meeting coming up, and I can attend that meeting and I can voice my public comment on that. There are some other provisions of the Open Public Meetings Act, but that's generally what it is in a nutshell. It's meant to bring out in the open the discussions and the decision-making process so that the public can be aware of what's going on with their taxpayer monies.
Okay, I think it is in the 70s. It was a post-Watergate legislation, if I remember correctly.
It was a while ago.
Yeah, you probably weren't even born, so but Peter, but boards do sometimes they can and do have usually time limits for individuals and the whole public comment period. Why do you do that?
So that's actually in the board governance policies, and the board sets that. It's usually part of the bylaws. For example, they may have a rule that people can only speak for 3 minutes and only once on a particular topic. It's to ensure that the meeting moves along and that public is heard, but it's kept to a reasonable time frame. Oftentimes things are limited to 1 hour per topic, for example, with 3-minute speakers of each. It's simply to ensure that we can move along and get the business of the board done, while also opening it up to a reasonable amount of time for public comment. If people still don't feel heard or they don't have the opportunity, they can always submit written letters to the board, which can become part of the record. So they can be read at a meeting, or they can be, depends again on policy as to what the board does. So these are all governance issues about how the board manages their time in meetings and gets the work of really promoting students forward.
Kerri, I know some boards, when they see that there's an issue, maybe when we went through COVID, that there's a big concern out there, they will sometimes say, normally we have 45 minutes, but we see that there's a lot of public concern. They go, we're going to go up to an hour today. Is that okay?
Yes. So as Peter said, most boards have a bylaw or a policy that sets forth the operation of their board meeting. How are we going to run our board meeting? And so many boards do place a limit on the individual speakers as well as the overall speaker. And I agree with Peter, the most common is 3 minutes for each speaker or an hour for the total public comment section. But the board president does have authority to modify that if it is necessary based on the number of people that are in the public. It's also fine for the board president at some point to say, okay, we're going to hear 3 more people because we've been here for an hour or an hour and a half, and then I'm gonna cut it off, but anyone else who has comments can submit them in writing. It's all about fairness. Really, that's how I would sum it up. A lot of folks think, well, it's not fair if the board is cutting us off and we should be sitting here and listening to everyone who wants to speak. But sometimes board meetings go to 11 o'clock, midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning. And you have to think about it not being fair to other people who may want to address something before the board. Or sometimes the public comment goes on so long, the board is actually taking its action on its agenda at 10 or 11 o'clock at night or midnight. And people who want to know, is this thing on the agenda going to pass? They're now having to wait until midnight. So a lot of it is just about fairness, and it's about trying to balance what needs to be done in the meeting.
One of the things that the public really likes, and what is a closed session? What are they discussing behind those closed doors? I'll go back to you on this one, Kerri, because there are specific things that they can discuss in closed session, sometimes called executive session, depending on what part of New Jersey you're from, I think. I'm not sure. So Kerri?
Super secret. Everybody wants to know what goes on behind closed doors. So the Open Public Meetings Act, again, does specifically provide very limited exceptions. When I said a few minutes ago that statute was adopted to allow the public to hear the decision-making process and the discourse, the discussion back and forth between board members, there are certain things that the legislature acknowledged would potentially harm people in certain groups if those discussions took place in public. So the big example of things, and I can go over just a couple of them very quickly, but the big example is personnel. So if it involves personnel, so evaluating a member of the staff, or determining whether to hire a specific person, discussing their qualifications, discussing potentially discipline or termination, that all takes place in executive session because it could harm that individual if that discussion takes place publicly. Now, there's an exception. That member of the staff has to be advised that they're going to be discussed, and that member has the ability to say, I want this to be done publicly. But if that particular staff member doesn't ask for it to be done publicly, then it has to be done confidentially in executive session. Another big piece is student-related issues. So if there's student-related matters, contract negotiations is another big one that can take place. Why? Because if the Board of Education had to discuss its strategy for contract negotiations publicly, it would definitely harm the Board of Education and the public body, because the other folks would be able to hear exactly what their strategy is. I think the last big one is that any matter that is covered by the attorney-client privilege. So when the board wants legal advice on how to address whether it's litigation or whether it is a personnel matter, that's often where I'm invited into the board meeting, and those typically take place in executive session because it's meant to protect the privilege that comes with that communication. So I think that sums up the general times. There are some other items related to security and some things, but those are the big ticket items where a board would go into executive session.
Yeah, I want to just a little bit on the comment about student privacy and also the personnel. Peter, sometimes at a board meeting, the board is restricted on who they can talk about. The public is not, doesn't have those same restrictions. So how do you respond to a community member who might be critical of a staff member, or sometimes even parents name students?
Yeah, so that's an important point, Ray. We actually have something we read out before public comment saying that people in the public are not held, that they basically expose themselves potentially to legal concerns if they go after somebody publicly. But as a superintendent, we don't want it to get to that. And as a board, we typically stop that. We say, thank you very much. You're now going after a staff member, which is not acceptable in public. So you do have to allow them to say things, but you do have to also think about protecting the staff and protecting the integrity of the district.
Okay. Kerri, you have any other thoughts on that before I go on?
No, I'll just say, boards have to be careful with the First Amendment. And one thing for board meetings to know and for the public to know is that they do have a First Amendment right to come to a board meeting and express their discontent or their dissatisfaction. So there isn't anything wrong with that. And boards do need to be careful not to cut off only the negative and allow people to come and praise everything that they're doing. But as soon as something negative comes out, they shut it down. So boards need, when they host their board meetings, to be cognizant of that the First Amendment allows both sides of an issue to be presented publicly.
Yeah, so that 3-minute time when we were talking about, even if they're saying nice things, you want them to go on. 3 minutes is 3 minutes.
Yep, you got to be fair. It's fairness, right?
That's right.
Fairness.
The last thing I know a lot of members of the community don't understand is the committee system, because that is a little bit different. And most boards have some type of committee system. Some are a committee of the whole. But what is the committee system and how does it work? And Kerri, why don't you start this one, and then Peter can talk to it as an administrator too.
Sure. You mentioned different committee systems. So the two big ones are either operating as a committee of the whole or individual committees. So a committee of the whole means that the board, the entire board is the committee. So some boards will have 2 meetings a month, one of which is a working session where they don't take any action. because they're going to go over items that some boards might in a committee situation. But others find it just more effective to have a smaller group of the board really look into a particular issue or oversight of a particular area. So for instance, on the Chester board, we have personnel, policy, and academics is one of our committees, and another committee is finance and facilities. So we do it that way because it's just easier to have more like in-depth discussions about certain topics with a smaller group. That group will read all the documents, we'll talk to the superintendent or the business administrator in more depth about a specific topic, and then we'll present it publicly to the whole board. So the whole board is advised of whatever is the recommendation, whatever is the outcome. But sometimes you just need a smaller committee to delve through the nitty-gritty and the details and weed out options that are really not going to be good options and bring the best option or the top two options back to the board. And that's really what the committee structure is for. Boards also typically will have a negotiations committee. And again, that's a smaller committee that will work with the particular union to go through negotiations and bringing recommendations back to the full board. It's not meant to keep the public excluded from the discussion. It's really meant to best facilitate decision-making and getting to an end point. And sometimes it's just not conducive to a large meeting with 9 or 7 board members all at the same time.
For clarification, committee meetings do not have to be, there doesn't have to be a notice for that, though some districts I do know give a public notice on that. Is that correct?
That is correct. So from a legal perspective, as long as there isn't a quorum of the board, which if you have a 9-member board would be 5 members. So most committees, if it's a 9-member board, will be 4 board members. If there's not a quorum, then it does not need to be a public meeting.
Peter, any comments from you on the committee system? Because you have to have an administrator usually at most committee meetings. Doesn't have to always be the superintendent. It could be the business administrator if it's the finance. Do you find it helpful?
I think it's really important because there's division of labor, and it allows you to also allow people on the board to become specialists. They are volunteers. It's something to remember. These people have jobs, they have children that they're taking care of, they have lives. And as a superintendent, I think the committee system is much more helpful in allowing them to balance their volunteer responsibilities and their life responsibilities. And it also allows me to utilize some of the superpowers of my board members. Let me give you an example. I have someone who does PR for a living. So we have a public relations committee, and she's outstanding at contributing there. And I think that sometimes you have these people who are on boards that actually have great things that they can contribute. And it's a way of really doing better work as a board.
And just for the members who are viewing this, the committee doesn't make a decision. It makes a recommendation to the entire board, and then the board acts on that recommendation. They don't have to take the recommendation of the committee. I think if there's a good working relationship and the committees are communicating well, they do usually say yes or agree with the recommendation. So that brings us to an end to this discussion of board meetings. We could probably do a whole program just on board meetings. I'd like to thank Kerri and Peter for joining me once again, and I hope you enjoyed it.